This is The Second Studio, hosted by the Architecture and Design Office fame. My name is David Lee, and with me is Marina Bourderonnet. The two of us are architects, partners at the office, and of course, hosts of the show. And today it's the two of us, and we are going to be talking about the rebuilding effort of the city of Los Angeles. And some of the things we're going to cover are broad enough to be applied to any rebuilding process as a result of a fire. And some of the things we're talking about, specifically the permitting approvals process and timelines, are specific to the city of LA, and even more specifically to our knowledge of the Pacific Palisades.
So it seems like the first thing, right, is to get rid of the debris that's on the site.
Yeah, so site cleanup is happening in two phases. The first phase is really to remove the hazardous materials. And then the second phase is the debris cleanup portion. And in the first phase, it's the hazardous cleanup is being handled by the EPA. And then the second phase is done by ACE, or the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The thing is, and FEMA is the one I believe that's managing the whole kind of operation. The thing is, for some of the properties in the Palisades, they have been put on a deferred list by FEMA,
Okay.
which sounds maybe more alarming than it actually is. What it means is that their site will still be cleaned up by the EPA, but just at a later time.
Is that because there is more toxic waste then?
It's because those sites are more difficult to clean up. Probably because the amount of debris makes it difficult to access the site. And so the logic that's being employed is that the EPA can come in, clean a lot of sites that are easier to do quickly, and then tackle the more difficult ones later on. So going private is a potential benefit if you have a property. Like we know some people who have properties that they were put on the deferred list. They don't want to wait, right, for several reasons, which we'll get into. So they've chosen to go with a private contractor to do the hazardous waste material, and also in their case, the debris cleanup, which would be categorized as phase two if you're utilizing the government. So the other question that for a lot of folks are facing is whether or not they should use ACE, the Army Corps of Engineers, or go private.
Mm-hmm.
And there's sort of this thought that if I use the Army Corps of Engineers, it's free. But that's not exactly the case, because the Army Corps of Engineers will still bill your insurance for the amount of work it took for them to do the work. There are still some advantages in that, though. I believe that they don't bill the insurance company until much later. Other factors with the Army Corps of Engineers is that, you know, they're going to come in and do whatever they do. You don't have control over what they're doing as much as if you went private.
So if you have like pieces of buildings or things that are on site that you want to keep in your rebuild project,
yes,
they might not be as mindful and detailed, let's say, because they have a lot of sites to clear.
Exactly. If your property it was completely gone and you know that nothing is worth keeping, then ACE might be a good option if you can get them to be scheduled, you know, in time. If your property was, you know, let's say half damaged or something like that, and you needed the debris cleanup workers to be very meticulous about what they're doing, ACE is probably not the best route for you. I have heard that in some instances, homeowners are sort of working with ACE to you know, communicate what they want to keep and not keep, but
you have to anyone have the time and the ability to do that.
Yeah, anyone in the, you know,
and the knowledge
construction industry is probably like, yeah, I don't really see how that's going to work out so well. But these are things that we've heard.
So isn't there a deadline to opt into ACE, using ACE though? Yeah,
so this recording, I think we're going to push to get out in time for it to be useful, hopefully. But it's the end of March. You have to decide by then whether or not you're using ACE.
Gotcha.
And what we're advising everybody, and we've heard this from many other professionals as well, is for homeowners to opt in with using ACE, because you can always opt out. So if you opt in and the next, you know, couple weeks you change your mind, you can always opt out. But if you opt out, you can't opt in. And so that's kind of the strategy that a lot of people are doing, because there's a lot of information that is still being learned on a 24-hour basis. And so there's nothing hurting you to opt in.
So there is kind of like the selection of who's removing the debris, but I think in that you also have to wonder and ask the companies, like if you go private, where are they going to bring the debris to? Like where is the dump site?
Yeah.
Because some dump sites only take the debris coming from ACE.
Yep.
You also don't really want to hire just like 3 guys in a van to come and clean up your lot. No, but you know, I mean, if you don't know better,
a
right?
man
like
in a van for moving. Yeah.
So that's an important question.
It's true. So that's one of the potential big issues with this many houses being lost is it's an opportunity for a lot of people professionals to swoop in and get work, which is a good thing for the professionals if they know what they're doing. Potentially a bad thing if you have folks who are
just trying to make money.
Trying to make money and sort of taking advantage of the situation. And we've heard that the debris removal process by those companies is becoming less and less straightforward because there's only so many roads to get in. Like you said, some of the dump sites have changed their minds. They're like, oh, by the way, now we only take debris from ACE, and so you can't dump here. So you really need to hire like you said, companies that are good at what they do and they know what they're doing for sure. The other thing too with debris cleanup and the things that are remaining are foundations. In a lot of cases, the majority of the house is gone, but it would appear to be that the foundations are still there.
Yeah, and that's kind of a question that we've seen come across like quite a bit because everybody knows, right, that foundation costs a lot of money to build. The first time you build them. And it's kind of like a chunk of money that just sits in the dirt that you never see, right? It's kind of like, well, look, if I can reuse what I have, despite me having lost, everything, if I could save some money there, like that would be good. So, it would make sense for a homeowner to wonder, like, can I just reuse the foundation? Because it's concrete anyway, right? So it's in the dirt, it didn't burn, it's still there. Like, is it reusable?
So all the foundations, let's assume we're talking about all the sites where the house is gone and foundations are, quote, still there visually. All those foundations have to be tested by a dedicated engineer, and that's their job, is to test the structural integrity of existing structures like foundations. They have to be tested, of course. And there's a couple of ways they do testing. So there's a visual inspection, which basically is there's an expert that goes out there and looks at the foundation and draws an opinion. They do a hammer test, which is a device. It's not just a hammer used for nails. It's a specific hammer device to do that. And depending on what that test reads, then they go further and do invasive testing, where they actually core, meaning they take out a chunk of the foundation and then test it. They also do stress tests on the anchor bolt. So they pull up so for anyone who doesn't know, their framing is tied down to the foundation with anchor bolts, let's say. And so they do a stress test by basically pulling on the bolt to see how much resistance there is. And so they do all these things kind of in succession, because you don't start off by just drilling into the foundation. So they do all these things. The problem is that a lot of these houses were built so long ago that even if it's determined that your foundations are still structurally sound from when they were first built, they were built at a time when the foundation structural requirements are different from today. Right. So if you have a house from like the 80s, the 90s, or even certainly earlier than that, it's not, you can't just reuse the foundations, right? If you did, they'd have to be brought up to code. So there'd be retrofitting of it. I think there'd be the addition of more or new anchor bolts.
Yeah.
I think the bigger question, though, is, and I was speaking with a couple engineers about this, is if you are building ostensibly a brand new house that's going to cost millions of dollars, and it's 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, whatever, how many square feet, should you be building it on top of foundations from the 80s or 90s? Forget the fire aspect of it. And the answer is no, you shouldn't. It's not a good idea to do that, right? And for the houses that have burned completely away and there's only foundations, there's a good chance those foundations are damaged to some degree.
Yeah.
Because it's not like the fires just kind of went by. That means the fire was cooking the house for hours probably, and in direct contact with those concrete foundations.
And I think even then during the debris removal process, they might get damaged, or like you also don't know, some part of the Palisades and around also had like mudslides and all kinds of things. So at the end of the day, it's like, how much would you be saving by trying to reuse them? And if you have to bring them up to code, what is the cost delta of doing that versus just starting new?
It's the cost delta, and also it's like, just again, in principle, do you want to build a brand new house that's meant to last you for the next 50 years of your life on foundations from 30 years ago that survived a fire? Like, it's not super logical, right?
Well, the thing is, like you keep an existing wall or like an existing roof, like you could always access it, redo it, change it, take it down. Foundation, if you need to fix it in 5 years, it's like a pain. It's really complicated.
The funny thing is, obviously everyone who lost their houses, if they had insurance, are dealing with insurance companies. And it could go to, playing the mind reading game of insurance companies. It could go one of like two ways. Either they want to test the foundations to say, okay, they're still good, so we don't have to pay for new foundations. And I'm an insurance company now; I don't have to pay for new foundations. The other mentality they could take, I suppose, is I want to have new foundations because that's less liability for me as an insurance company in the future. And the way that construction has evolved and the way we build things, both in practice and also in the code, is just so different than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. So, I think we mentioned on a previous recording, some of this bleeds over into just general remodel thinking, forgetting the fires, right? Like we've worked on projects where houses were built in the 50s, the mid-century, right? And it's like, well, are we going to do this massive, massive gut remodel and build basically a brand new house and keeping some studs on top of an old foundation? We don't know really what's in there. And at some point, when you get to that threshold of scope and budget spending, then it doesn't make sense anymore. Yeah. Now, it is true, of course, for some people, they might be in a situation where they have a hard cap on their budget or whatever other constraints, and then you have to do retrofitting, and I certainly understand that. This conversation, part of the conversation, would be completely different, though, if you had just built a house, right?
Of course, yeah.
First of all, that would be, it's heartbreaking in any case, but you just built a house, so the foundations now that we're then talking about are new ones. They're from this last 2 years. That's different. That then you're more likely to be able to reuse them.
Then you can
if
definitely
they're not
test
too
it.
damaged.
Yeah. But deciding to remove the foundation or keeping the foundation is also something that you have to take into consideration now before debris removal happens. Because if you do decide to get rid of them, then that could be taken care of at the same time. Yeah. So, you kind of have to not waste too much time, especially if you have to do testing, if you're unsure if you can keep it or not.
Yeah.
The other advantage, I would say, with new foundation is that if you keep the foundation, you're going to be tied to the footprint of what was the house before, right? And that kind of leads us to the next point, which is like, do I rebuild exactly what was there? Do I do something slightly different, or do I do something completely different, right?
Yeah.
Keeping existing foundation is providing you with limitation of what you can rebuild in some ways.
Yeah, and on that note, I'm sure folks are wondering, well, can I change the existing foundation? The answer is it depends on the foundation and
the changes.
and the changes. So generally the answer is yes, you can to a degree. This is going back to other remodel projects we're doing now. You can pour a new slab on top of an existing slab. You could carve out an existing slab and replace it with a new one, depending on how the rebar inside of the slab was done. But you're right, you're still working with this existing thing. And again, there's this threshold that we all have to be mindful of. If you're doing a certain scale of work, why are we bothering to try and limit ourselves or fight one arm tied behind our back, or trying to run a race with one leg? You don't need to.
And I think it's about thinking about the bigger picture and not getting, not becoming trapped into like those very specific questions that come into play right now in those first phases of, rebuild.
The bigger picture also depends on your goals as a client and why you're deciding to rebuild. Yeah. Right. If you're rebuilding and you're thinking, well, I'm going to rebuild and bounce and get out of here in the next few years, that's a different set of criteria and goals for you. First of all, I don't know anyone who's going to go through this process of the fires.
I would say just say a lot and don't even bother at this point, right?
So I feel like a lot of the people we've spoken with who are rebuilding, it's because they want to stay in the Palisades or they want to stay in their neighborhood for personal reasons, right? For family reasons, for whatever other reasons. And so if this project you're undertaking is a long-term, it's an investment, yes, but it's a long-term, thing for yourself, then that's where it goes back to the bigger picture. That's what I would keep in mind and really think about that more so than some of these like nitty-gritty details that have been coming up.
I mean, in some ways, like those homeowners are rebuilding a part of their life. Let's just put it that way, because a home is, that's your life, like especially if you've been living in those houses for quite some time. So I think, thinking about the bigger question in that case is super important.
You alluded to the topic of adhering to the existing foundations and kind of the pros or cons of that from a design standpoint. And this bleeds over into the subject of how rebuilt properties are permitted in the city of Los Angeles. So again, this aspect of the conversation specific to the city of Los Angeles, perhaps even more specific to the Palisades, let's say. So there's a few things we want to clarify. There's been this phrase called like for like, rebuilding like for like, that has been used.
Which is super confusing.
It's been used out there, right? And maybe actually even in some of the official language from the city. And so one way of rebuilding or of doing a project is to rebuild like for like. That's what people say, but rebuild like for like. Well, it's not an accurate term, because when anyone hears like for like, what do we think? We
Identical.
think that we have to build like for like. We have to build what was there. We built the same square footage, same stories, same height, same doors, same windows, same aesthetics from the outside, right? If I had a porch, I have to build a porch back. Everything is like for like. That is actually not what it is per the permitting, the code and the regulations, though. And so I feel the term like for like is very deceptive.
And I wonder, honestly, I wonder if it's been done on purpose. So I don't know. So people just rebuild
just to
what
make
was there
things
before,
go faster,
or slower. I don't know. I don't know. I feel like language and vocabulary here could have been made a bit more explicit for people to very clearly understand like what that means.
No.
So I don't know.
So there are two ways you can go about rebuilding a site. There is an eligible or qualifying rebuild. Those two terms will be together, eligible or qualifying. And then there's non-eligible and non-qualifying. Okay. So eligible and qualifying means that you're building something that allows you to have certain advantages because you're building something that's roughly the same size as it was before. And you're given exemptions. So you are eligible for exemptions from certain things because you're building something back that's close to what was there before. Not like for like, but sort of close. If you're building something that's not close to what was there before, then you are now in the category of a non-eligible or non-qualifying project. It simply means that you don't qualify for exemptions. Okay, then in that case, you're basically doing a standard project. It just happens to be there, your house burned down, but you're just doing a standard project, and you can do whatever you want that follows the current, zoning codes and regulations.
Gotcha. Would the non-eligible could be technically a remodel, or would they all be categorized as new construction?
Technically, so that's a super good question, and this is something I don't think a lot of people are talking about. It could be either. Okay. But let's get into that in a little bit. Okay. So let's first talk about the eligible projects and the qualifying projects. And these are also in the same bucket as the like for like. What like for like actually means is that you are building something that is within 110% of the area, height, and location and footprint of what was there before. That means to say that when you're rebuilding your house, you can go bigger and change its footprint and everything else by an extra 10%.
Okay.
If you stay within that extra 10%, then you are considered an eligible rebuild, and there's a bunch of exemptions that you gain because of this.
So that would impact your square footage, your height,
and bulk.
Maybe your lot coverage,
is the last one. So. Gotcha. So in architectural terms, we would refer to it as the massing, which massing means, if you can just imagine kind of big blocks on site, the rough shape of the house, right? Can't change beyond an extra 10%. And it's quantified by, again, the square footage, the height of the building, the number of stories, the bulk, which means its rough shape and footprint, have to be within 10%. So what you can't do is say, okay, if I had a house that was 3,000 square feet and I'm going to build back now 3,300 square feet, can I move my house to the other side of the lot or make my house a circle instead of a square, let's say? No, you can't, because a circle instead of a square is radically different. And it's not like a 10% shift from a square, right? If you try to move your house from one corner of the property all the way to the other, somehow you have that ability because of a big enough lot. That's also is not considered an eligible rebuild, because you are dramatically changing the massing and the site planning of the project.
Can you underbuild? Like if you fit within the massing of what was there before, but you actually build less?
You can underbuild, yeah. And some people are doing that because of cost.
Right.
It's just so expensive.
It's not like you have to build like up to 100% of what was there before. Like you can always go down if you need to.
Yeah, the rule is that is the bonus 10%,
is the max.
Right, to give you some wiggle room.
Yeah. I do want to go back though and touch on the exemptions that you mentioned.
Yeah, so the exemptions for an eligible project, which again means you're not building more than an extra 10%, you are exempt from CEQA, the Coastal Commissions Act, and there's a third one, which I'm forgetting right now. You're exempt from, you're allowed to put back any non-conforming structures. So I'm going to talk about the first two. Anyone in Southern California or all of California knows that if your property is located in a coastal zone, and therefore you have to undergo coastal commission reviews, it is unpleasant, to say the least. So if your property is in the coastal zone, rebuilding back the house and not having to go through that commission, the coastal commission, is a huge benefit for sure. The other one was non-conforming structures. Which
means, for example, if your house was built on a side yard setback that was like 2 feet off of the property line where you're supposed to have 5, that means you can rebuild where it was.
Yeah.
Which in some ways is a huge advantage because you can't do that anymore.
Yeah.
So that is something to consider. I think there was also things about like keeping a gas line.
Yeah.
Right.
So obviously the code evolves, and the code now prohibits certain things. Now gas is not allowed. So when you do a new construction project, there's an all-electric mandate. You can only use electricity. You can't have gas. So that also, if you had gas before, you can still have gas now because you're doing a qualifying rebuild and you're staying within that extra 10%. The same thing applies for heights and even the use of the property. In this conversation, or at least for what we do, we're talking about houses to houses, so that's not so much of an issue. In addition, you cannot add a basement and have that not count toward the square footage to be eligible. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
So it's part of your total square footage.
Yeah, which some of us don't quite agree with, because the whole point of the 110% rule is that you're building back kind of roughly what was there from a site planning perspective.
From an above ground.
From above ground perspective. So who cares if I'm adding a basement? Let me add a basement and give me the benefits of being an eligible rebuild. That's not what's happening. Now, here's the thing. The eligible rebuild, quote, like for like, and all those other ways of describing it, has been talked about as the fastest way to get an approval, because it is expedited, right? And it's been kind of, marketed, let's say, as if you want to rebuild quickly, do this. Stay within the 110%, do all the stuff that we talked about, and you're going to have the fastest approval process. You're going to get your permit, and it's going to be the easiest thing and the most painless way to go about it.
So my question is, who's saying those things that are not true?
So here's why it's not necessarily as advantageous as it seems. So let's go through it. So first of all, we talked about exemptions from CEQA and the coastal commissions.
Right, which is a huge one because it saves you time and money in the process.
However, I don't know the math of it, but like half or more of the properties in the Pacific Palisades are not in a coastal zone anyway. So that has no bearing on a lot of people. At all, right?
It's like saying your car comes with doors. Okay, great. I mean,
the exemptions for non-conforming uses, right? Most houses don't have extreme conditions where they were built so far past the setbacks where it's a huge issue. The gas thing, Well, is it that big of a deal to keep gas or not? I don't know. And in fact, here's a thing that I don't think a lot of people know, is that even if you do a non-eligible, non-qualifying project, you can actually still have gas in the house because it's a fire rebuild. Now, here's the caveat with that, is that new energy codes would apply to that project, which make it very difficult to have gas with all the calcs, which I know I'm getting confusing. But I was talking with the city official the other day, like I was having lunch with them. He's like, well, you can still have gas in a new construction project if it's a fire rebuild because you're still classified under the bigger umbrella of a fire rebuild. And then the other big benefit that's being talked about is this expedited approvals permitting process
Right.
if you do the like-for-like eligible rebuild thing. Well, what has been, I think, guaranteed to date, as far as I know, is that all that means is that the first review of the drawings you submit will be done within 30 days, which is good. That's faster than usual.
Yeah.
But it does not talk about the subsequent reviews that will take place after that. So for anyone who doesn't know anything about, buildings and permitting, so you submit your permit drawings to the city, it gets reviewed. In the city of Los Angeles, San Francisco, a lot of major cities, you can guarantee you're going to have plan check corrections, which means that there's a plan checker who's going to put a bunch of red lines and say, fix a bunch of stuff and resubmit. It's going to happen, right? So this expedited process only talks about the first review session. It doesn't say how quickly they're going to review the plan check corrections that you've submitted, the new set of drawings with the corrections, satisfied. In addition, all projects that are a fire rebuild, eligible and non-eligible, will be expedited because there's a dedicated team of officials for these projects separate from everyone else. So even if I'm doing a non-eligible rebuild, okay, I'm still expedited.
Right.
And I've heard that in the end, both will be about the same timeline in terms of speed. I've also heard that, well, the eligible rebuilds will still have an edge to them, but it's only like a couple months of approval timeline, which maybe for the layperson sounds like, wow, a couple months, that's saving me a lot of time. It's nothing. Any professional you talk to, the timeline we think about is the entire project. An extra couple months inside of the building department, planning department, is nothing. So basically, level playing ground in terms of the approvals timeline between eligible and non-eligible. So coastal commissions, if you're not in a coastal zone, no impact. Non-conforming uses, probably not an issue. If you had non-conforming uses or not uses, structures, any good architect can design within the constraints and make something beautiful and amazing. And then the whole, this is the fastest way to get an approval. Maybe not. Probably not, actually. And if it is, it's by a month or 2 months, which is nothing. So I think this is very critical because with the fires, there's a tendency for everyone to focus on fire-specific information, right? Which is important and true. But don't let that distract you from the bigger picture that you have in mind and distract you from these other options, which are going to be about the same in terms of time and give you massive flexibility to do whatever you wanted and not be adhered to the previous footprint of the house.
I think also the permitting aspect being much quicker and whatever is appealing. But if you are rebuilding your forever house, the design process is going to take some time.
Yeah.
So it's not unless you already have your set approved or you were in the middle of, working on your permit set or whatever, get it out and try and, get back on it as soon as you can. But for most people, I think they're going to start from scratch because they're not planning to redo their home. Their home was there. Yeah. Finding the right architect, finding the right team to rebuild your house, thinking about how you want to rebuild. And I think taking the time to do it right. And I cannot imagine also emotionally being in that headspace. I don't think you want to rush or feel like you have to rush and quickly move into rebuilding your house. If you need the time to take the time to decide how you want to approach that, you should take it, you know.
Yeah. So I think for the average person who elects to build a house, which a lot of these people were not in that situation, right? But the person who elects to build a house, they very severely underestimate the time, effort, sometimes stress and money and schedule, involved to create a house. And that's just a fact. Again, I'm saying this, talk to any seasoned architect or contractor, they'll say like, yes, people don't understand how complex and how long it takes. And for people who have been forced into this situation, you are now one of those people where you're choosing to stay. You're now one of those. You're a client. You're now having to build a house.
And I think there is pressure that comes from the insurance company who's asking like, what are you doing? You got to decide what you want to be doing. Maybe your neighbors. You see your neighbors are deciding what they're doing, and it's. Yeah, it's a personal journey to get on building a home. So I don't think you should feel like all of those things around you are pressuring you to move quickly and decide A or B like right now. I think you should have the time to get the headspace to think about that.
Look, if you're a person listening and you loved your house, like it was perfect, and you want it back the way it was, then just rebuild it the way it was. I'm not advising otherwise in that situation. But let's be honest, for most people, they're in a house, and yes, they are I'm sure heartbroken because they have fond memories of what all the events and things that took place in it. But the house itself, they're probably like, man, I was always thinking about doing this project, this kitchen remodel, or this addition, or X, Y, and Z. There's this aspect of the house I never cared for. Well, silver lining, this is the chance to do what you want to do now, right? Yeah. And I think a lot of people, forget the whole fire, portion of the conversation. A lot of people just in general are living in houses that they're not happy with, right? Because they didn't design this house.
In LA.
Especially, there's a lot of crappy houses, and they end up in these crappy houses that don't flow well, and they just don't feel good. And sometimes the homeowners, they feel it, and other times they don't feel it. But there's like a lot of room for improvement. So if you're forced into a situation of building a new house, then build it for the long term and build it in a way that it should be, and have it designed in a way that it should be, and not just a knee-jerk reaction to put back what was there.
Yeah. I think on that subject, though, if people want or need to, have plans of the house that was there before, because either they want to rebuild exactly what was there before, or they do want to do like an eligible project where they need to show what was there before. Like where was the house located on the site, how height was how many stories, and what was the building height, the setbacks and all of that stuff. Some people might not have plans, like they bought a house and it didn't come with floor plans, right? What you could do is go to the city of LA and ask for records of the property. Depending on when the house was built, if there was an architect or an engineer involved, if there was drawings, they might have something on the record, and you can get access to these.
Yeah, and I think Newsom recently, maybe it was a week ago now, released I don't know what you call it, a mandate, an ordinance, or whatever, stating that those old records need to be like released immediately. Like normally, when you go to the city has to then contact the owner of the drawings, the architect or the engineer, and get their permission, and then they forward it to you, right? Because it is still, like, in some ways, the property of those drawings, the property of those people. But in this case, it's just being pushed through, which makes sense. The city of LA only started documenting via microfilm, I think, in 1990, or just right around there. So if your house was built before then, if you're right at that cusp, like you're like the late 80s, you might have slipped in and been okay. But if you're way before then, you're probably gonna have a hard time getting a set of drawings.
Which might also determine like which route you're gonna have to go with the rebuild.
Well, there's been discussion about using drones and Google Earth footage to kind of informally document what was there. There hasn't been any true clarity and clear and real answers from the city as to whether or not they're going to accept that kind of documentation. I suspect they will. A lot of us are suspecting that they will, but it remains to be seen. I also want to talk about like the focus on permitting timelines and permitting in general.
Right.
So like taking a step back again and just talking about projects, design, architecture, and construction in general for houses. There tends to be a disproportionate amount of focus by clients on permitting and how long permitting takes.
And that's more of a general observation.
General observation. There are for sure nightmare stories and nightmare projects and nightmare plan checkers where that process takes forever, like years in really bad cities and really specific situations. Yes. And there are always delays in that department, in that section of the process and the projects. However, I will say from an architect's lens, and the architect is the person that's with you from the very beginning when you first start thinking about doing a house until you move in, right? That entire timeline, that journey. Permitting is one blip within the timeline of the entire project. The work it takes to put permit drawings together is important. It's small. Construction documents, big. Design, big. Permitting could potentially be a real pain in the butt, but oftentimes in our office, in a lot of cases, we're doing CDs during that time anyway. Construction documents during that time anyway. So my larger point I'm trying to make is that I wouldn't let, especially these specific permit information about eligible and non-eligible, like dictate the rest of the project, which is like 95% of the project. Like design, hugely important. Construction documents, hugely important. Construction takes a long time too. I mean, obviously, and that's where all the money's being spent. Like that, those other things are really the bigger consideration because again, when we zoom out, you're building a new house and it doesn't have to be what was there before.
Yeah.
You know? And I just think it's very easy for everyone to zoom and just focus on like, well, eligible, non-eligible, 110%, this and that. Like, but these are small, very, very small things in the overall effort of the project, and small things that are potentially very critical. Like you said, if you choose to do eligible because it sounds like it's the fastest, right, and whatever else, but now you're stuck with a previous footprint. Like, well, why?
You know, and it's hard for people who've never gone through any of that before because they have to make decisions, you know, without really having all of the information. And there is,
that's why.
And the problem is that there is a lot of information out there since the fire happens. You know, here and there, you hear this, you hear that, but there is not, I think, clear information. So it gets very confusing.
Yeah. Well, this is why, not to sound like an, you know, advocate for architects as a biased person because I'm an architect, but that's why you need an architect. You need to talk to an architect because the architects, what they do for any project, especially with something like this, is they bring in all the information, they distill it, and they decide and they order it. They make a mental hierarchical outlay and decide what's important, not important to shape the project. For folks who are looking at this process through a keyhole and they don't know anything about the profession, what happens is whatever information they hear, it sounds bigger than it might be, right? Because they don't have the rest of the picture. They don't have the full picture that I described from conceptual design all the way to moving in, right? The architect and to some degree the contractor does. And so I suppose that's a way of advocating or suggesting that anyone who's in this process, don't try and make critical decisions or almost any decisions without talking to, you know, having serious conversations with an architect and or contractor, but probably an architect to help provide guidance. And I've said this before on the podcast as well, where in normal situations, that's one of the classic mistakes that clients make is they try to do a bunch of work and thinking before hiring an architect. And the architect comes in and they say, well, good on you for trying, but I'm going to reshift everything you've said because what you've said doesn't actually really make sense considering the big picture. Yeah. So you've got to surround yourself with good professionals and start the conversations. Of course, it would be remiss of me if I didn't mention the fact that budget plays into all of this. And the things that I'm describing are potentially a non-starter for someone who's on an ultra tight budget. And I certainly understand that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the architecture community in LA is pretty strong right now, and everybody is kind of like, you know, rolling up their sleeves and trying to see like how everybody can help all of the victims of the fires. So talking about budget, you know, and maybe having some homeowners that don't really know what to do or don't really know like how to approach this thing and might not even be able to hire an architect. I think you could still reach out to a lot of architects in LA who would be more than happy to have like a 15-minute, half an hour conversation, on the phone and try and understand what is it that, where is your property and what are you trying to decide, and give you their best advice, and if not, like guide you to the right people.
Yeah.
So, sometimes architects could feel like they're like way out of reach, or they're like pretentious and
your homeowners might think
if I call them but I don't hire them, like, oh, they're going to give me information. I think in this case, like any architect you would call in LA would really help you out.
And that's how we operate. I mean, for our office, like I'm always on phone calls with people who could be clients and could not be. It's fine with me. I'll spend an hour with you and help you out. I mean, it's because I understand the amount of commitment and the importance of a house too. I mean, that's why we do what we do. We believe in the value that a house brings in good design. And if I can steer someone in the right direction, even if it's not with us, I will gladly spend an hour doing that. I think I do want to quickly touch back on the 110% and the site planning component, because I wonder if someone listening who is not an architect and their homeowner is thinking, well, but if I'm keeping the foundations, can't we just design something really good, making use of those foundations, and it'll be okay? Or where those foundations were. Because also to clarify that if you're doing an eligible rebuild, you can fully demolish the foundations, right? You just have to put what you're putting back has to be roughly what was there before in its shape and footprint and square footage. But why can't we adhere to that 110% rule but still have a really nice house? And depending on what was there before, it's certainly possible. But I'll say this, that the first thing in the design of any structure, and in this case a house, that dictates whether or not the design is going to be good is the site planning. That means where the structure is located on the site and how it's located on the site, and the massing and how many stories and whatever else. At a very kind of primitive level, primary level, before talking about the interior floor plans and where walls and doors go and where windows go and all that stuff, it's the site planning, it's the massing. So like we have a project, actually a couple projects now, where there was an existing house on site, or existing structures, multiple structures in some cases. And the question is, like, can we make use of these structures? And most of the time in construction, like the building construction aspect, yeah, we could. But these structures are so poorly positioned on the site that it's limiting us from actually utilizing the site and getting the most value out of the site, both in terms of ROI, resale value, but also the poetics and the feeling of the site and the quality of the design, quality of the site. That all starts with the massing. So that is, and any architect listening is like, yes, it does, because it's the first thing you learn in architecture school. It starts there.
Well, it's kind of like the basic, the basic stuff, but if you get that wrong, that just messes up everything else that follows.
There's nothing you can do to fix a bad site plan.
Like if, let's say, your house is like really, really close to like the fence in your backyard, and you have this, real estate of lawn in the front that nobody ever used, because who wants to have a party in the front yard of your house?
Yeah.
Well, maybe now is like a good opportunity to like relocate in a way that makes sense. Or maybe, I don't know. And what's interesting too is that homeowners are going to rebuild and their neighbors are going to rebuild. And I think that's also a very interesting, not experiment, but kind of like an interesting thing to happen, because how often do you and both of your neighbors are going to be rebuilding a house? Yeah. Never, right?
I know, at the same time.
So I think there is like the potential for very interesting conversation and even design solutions of things happening because of that. Also because it seems like the community in the Palisades is very tight. Like, people really know their neighbors. They talk to their neighbors. Yeah. Like they have relationships with their neighbors. It's not like, other neighborhoods where you don't even know who lives next to you, type of thing. So I think they could really create new things in the way we design a home, and we even design the neighborhood back,
I agree. You bring up a super good point, because for most projects, if you're in a typical neighborhood, you don't have a massive property with acres. As an architect, we first look at the context, right? We look at obviously what's allowed zoning wise, but we looked at the surrounding buildings and structures. Say, okay, your neighbor has a window right there. We're not going to put your primary bathroom window facing that window because that would be bad. In this case, it's all going to be new. So it is going to be critical for architects to talk to each other. I mean, I know we will be pursuing that. And I guess as homeowners, I would probably, I would recommend that you tell your architect, like, can you, I know my neighbor, I'll put you in touch with their architect. Can you guys talk to each other? Because you don't want to have your 2 bathroom windows that are like floor to ceiling glass.
Well, that's the thing, right? Because usually when you design a new home, you have existing, buildings next to you. So you kind of like design based on what the context around is.
Yeah.
But if everybody is designing, kind of ignoring the context because the context is gone,
you can't.
I mean, you're
have to co-design
designing with like your eyes closed. Like you don't know what's gonna happen. So yeah, I think that could be pretty interesting.
So we'll probably have more recordings like this in the future, hopefully, where it's just kind of updates on the things that we think will be helpful to people and things that we've learned. But I think the key point as a conclusion to this is utilize the architects and professionals for advice of seeing that bigger picture and helping you think about it that way, and to, again, provide order to the information so you don't let the information that's talked about the most be the thing that dictates and makes decisions for you.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes the thing that's talked about the most is not actually the most important thing in the case of these projects.
Yeah.
If you have questions, then reach out to us. More than happy, again, to help you out.
And if we're not the right fit for you, we can recommend you to a whole bunch of 100%. Architects.
Yeah, and so on that note, also, if you need someone for debris cleanup or anything else, anything that we talked about, reach out. We'll put you in touch with those people or find someone for you. You can find us we can find the office on Instagram, which it's fame_architects. Our office is famearchitects.com is the website. The podcast has a hotline, which you can call or text, which is 213-222-6950. You can find the podcast on Instagram. It's Second Studio Pod. And you can find both out there everywhere.
As we get more information with this whole process, we would share what we find or make sure that we keep people updated with that. But no, hopefully this is helpful.
Leave a review. Typically we start the outro by asking for a review, and I forgot. So leave a review if you like the show and appreciate it. And we'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.